The train groaned, a beast of iron and steam surrendering to the vast, indifferent emptiness of the plains. Its hiss was the only sound besides the wind that whipped Eleanor's thin dress against her legs. Before the wheels had fully ceased their turning, a rough hand clamped around her upper arm, hauling her from the suffocating heat of the passenger car and onto the splintered wood of the platform. The platform served a town that was little more than a smudge of brown buildings against an endless expanse of pale blue sky. Her stepfather, Silas, did not look at her. His eyes, small and hard as river stones, were fixed on the man waiting for them. The man stood alone, a silhouette against the harsh afternoon sun. He was tall, broad in the shoulders, and wore dust-caked denim and a flat-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. Silas shoved her forward a step. "This is her," he grunted, the words tasting of cheap whiskey and finality. The man, Colt McAllister, gave a slow, deliberate nod. His gaze flickered over Eleanor for a moment, so brief and impersonal she felt less like a woman and more like livestock being assessed. There was no warmth in his eyes, only a deep, settled weariness. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, heavy pouch that clinked with the sound of coins. He tossed it to Silas, who caught it with a practiced greed. Silas waited in his palm, his lips curling into a semblance of a smile. He did not say goodbye. He did not offer a word of comfort or a backward glance. He simply turned, climbed back onto the train, and disappeared into the car. The train gave a great shudder, belched a column of black smoke, and began its slow, grinding departure, leaving Eleanor alone on the platform with a stranger who had just purchased her. The silence that fell was heavier than the heat. Eleanor stood rigid, her small valise clutched in her white-knuckled hand, every muscle in her body screaming to run, but there was nowhere to run to. Only miles of sun-scorched earth and the silent man who now owned her future. He finally spoke, his voice a low rumble, rough like gravel. "Judge's office is this way." He did not offer a hand. He simply turned and started walking, his long strides eating up the dusty ground. Eleanor had no choice but to follow. A step behind him, the dust from his boots coating the hem of her worn gray dress. The judge's office smelled of stale cigar smoke and old paper. Judge Miller was a portly man with a sheen of sweat on his bald head. He peered at them over a pair of spectacles, his expression one of profound disinterest. He dipped a pen in an inkwell and pushed a document across the scarred surface of his desk. "Sign here, McAllister." Colt took the pen and scratched his name onto the paper with quick, jagged strokes. The document was a marriage contract, a piece of paper that bound her life to his with a few droplets of ink. It was a transaction, cold and clean. When the judge slid the paper toward her, Eleanor stared at it, her vision blurring with tears she refused to let fall. Her hand trembled as she took the pen. The ink bled slightly on the page, a dark stain spreading around her name. Eleanor Vance, now. Eleanor McAllister, a name that felt like a collar. "That'll be all," the judge said, already turning his attention to another stack of papers. He had not looked her in the eye once. He had not acknowledged the tears that now tracked clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. She was an object in a transaction he had overseen 100 times before. Outside, the town watched. Women paused with their market baskets, their faces pinched with disapproval as they whispered behind their hands. Their words floated on the hot, dry air. "Spoiled thing? Look at her. Probably got herself in trouble back east. And for him, that wild man from the hills. What's he want with a wife? Heard he's not right in the head since the war." The whispers were like tiny, sharp stones, pelting her from all sides. She flinched, pulling her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders as if it could ward off their judgment. She was a curiosity, a scandal, a piece of gossip to sweeten their bitter, dusty lives. Colt seemed not to hear them, or if he did, he gave no sign. He led her to a large bay horse tied to a hitching post. He untied the reins, his movements economical and sure. He still had not touched her, had not so much as brushed her arm. He gestured with his chin toward the saddle. "Get on." The horse was tall, and in her dress. The mount was clumsy and undignified. He turned his back, a gesture she could not decide was either cruelty or a strange sort of courtesy, giving her privacy in her struggle. She managed to pull herself up, her skirts tangled around her legs. He swung himself up behind her with an easy, fluid motion, his body a solid presence she could feel without touching. He did not wrap his arms around her to hold her in place. He simply took the reins, and the heat from his body was a wall at her back. "Hold the saddle horn," he commanded, his voice close to her ear. She obeyed, her fingers gripping the worn leather until her knuckles were white. With a soft click of his tongue, he urged the horse forward, and they left the town behind. The journey to his ranch was a slow, brutal torment. The land was an enemy. The sun was a hammer, beating down relentlessly. The wind was a constant thief, stealing the moisture from her skin and filling her mouth and eyes with grit. Sharp stones littered the trail, and the horse's hooves struck them with a monotonous, jarring rhythm. There was no green, only the muted, dusty tones of sagebrush and parched earth, stretching to a horizon that shimmered with heat. And then there was the silence. Colt did not speak. For hours, the only sounds were the plodding of the horse, the creak of the leather saddle, and the ceaseless sigh of the wind. The silence was not peaceful. It was an active, oppressive thing. It pressed in on Eleanor, filled with everything that had not been said. It gave her too much time to think, to feel the burning resentment that was a hot coal in her chest. She resented her stepfather for his greed, the judge for his indifference, the town for its cruelty. Most of all, she resented this silent, scarred man who held her future in his hands, and the harsh, unforgiving land he was dragging her into. This was not a home. It was a prison made of dirt and sky. By the time they arrived, the sun was a bleeding wound on the horizon, painting the clouds in violent shades of orange and purple. The ranch was not much more than a collection of weathered buildings huddled against the vast emptiness. A small, sturdy cabin, a large barn, and a few corrals. It looked lonely, stark, and utterly cheerless. He dismounted first, then reached up. For a moment, she thought he would finally touch her, lift her down. "Instead," he said, "slide down." She did, landing unsteadily on legs that were stiff and sore from the long ride. He led the horse toward the barn without a word, leaving her standing alone in the yard. She looked at the cabin, her new home. It was small, with a single window that looked like a dark, vacant eye. After a few minutes, he emerged from the barn and walked toward her. "Your room is there," he said, pointing to a smaller structure attached to the side of the main cabin. It had its own door, a separate entrance. He was making it clear. She was here, but she was not with him. He led her inside the main cabin first. It was one room, spare and ruthlessly clean. A stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a bed in the corner, and a few shelves holding tins and supplies. He gestured to the table, where a plate of cold biscuits and jerky sat next to a tin cup of water. Food. Then he walked her to the door of her room and opened it. It was tiny, barely large enough for the narrow cot and a small wooden crate that served as a table. A single blanket, thin and patched, was folded at the foot of the cot. It was as welcoming as a jail cell. "Good night," he said, his voice flat. He closed the door between the main cabin and her room, the sound of the latch clicking into place a definitive, final sound. He had offered her shelter and food, but not a single crumb of comfort. He would not even eat in the same room with her. Eleanor stood in the center of the tiny space, the silence of the cabin roaring in her ears. She looked at the plate of food he had left on the main table, her stomach hollow with hunger, but her pride was a stubborn, bitter knot in her throat. She would not eat his food. She would not speak his name. She sank onto the cot, her body aching with exhaustion, and stared at the rough wooden walls as darkness consumed the world outside. Sleep did not come. The wind, which had been a constant companion all day, began to change. It rose from a whisper to a moan, and then to a mournful howl. It rattled the small window of her room and seemed to claw at the very foundations of the cabin. Eleanor had known storms before, but this was different. This was the voice of the wilderness, wild and full of rage. A fine sift of dust began to rain down from the ceiling, coating the thin blanket, making the air thick and hard to breathe. She could hear the sand and grit scouring the outside walls. She sat up, wrapping her arms around her knees, shivering though the air was not cold. The darkness in the room was absolute, and with every shriek of the wind, her carefully constructed walls of anger and resentment began to crumble, revealing the raw fear beneath. She was alone, miles from anything she knew, trapped in a wooden box with a storm that sounded like it wanted to tear the world apart. She could not bear it. The thought of him, the stranger in the next room, was terrifying, but the thought of facing this monstrous storm alone was worse. On trembling legs, she pushed open her door and stumbled into the main cabin. It was empty. His bed was untouched. A deeper, colder fear gripped her. Had he left her? Left her here to be buried by the dust? A flicker of light from the direction of the barn caught her eye. Driven by a desperate need not to be alone, she pulled her shawl over her head and plunged out into the maelstrom. The wind hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and whipping her hair across her face. Dust filled her eyes and nose, gritty and suffocating. She fought her way across the yard, her feet sinking into the shifting ground, her eyes fixed on the sliver of light from the barn. The barn door was heavy, but she managed to slide it open just enough to slip inside. The air in the barn was thick with the warm, familiar smells of hay and animals, a comfort against the chaos outside. A single lantern cast a pool of golden, dancing light in the center of the vast, dark space. Colt was there, checking the latch on a stall where his horse stood, stamping nervously. He turned as she came in, his face unreadable in the flickering light. He did not seem surprised to see her. He simply watched as she leaned against the door, gasping for breath, her dress and hair caked with dust. She was shivering uncontrollably, from cold and from fear. He did not speak. He walked over to a hook on the wall and took down his heavy canvas coat. He walked back to her and held it out. It was not a gesture of affection, but of simple, practical necessity. She was cold. He had a coat. Eleanor hesitated for a moment, then took it, wrapping the heavy, warm fabric around her small frame. It smelled of him, of leather, dust, and something else, something faintly metallic like old iron. He then lit a second lantern, its steady glow pushing back the shadows. He placed it on a crate near the center of the barn floor, creating a small island of light and relative calm. He went back to his work, his movements slow and deliberate, his presence a silent, solid anchor in the storm. Eleanor huddled in the coat, watching him. The wind howled outside, but in here, with the sturdy walls of the barn around them and the soft glow of the lanterns, the fear began to recede, replaced by a profound and hollow exhaustion. The last few days, the last few years, crashed down upon her, and in the quiet of the barn, memory, unbidden, rose to the surface. She remembered her mother, not her face, not clearly, but the feel of her cool hand on a fevered forehead, the scent of lavender in the linen press, the sound of a lullaby hummed softly in the dark. It was a memory of warmth, of safety, a world that had vanished the day her mother's fever did not break. She had been 6 years old. Silas, her father's cousin, had arrived a month later, ostensibly to help run the small farm. He had a widower's charm that quickly soured once the papers were signed and the farm was his. The years that followed were a long, gray blur of servitude. She was no longer a daughter in her own home. She was an unpaid servant. She rose before dawn to light the fires and did not rest until long after Silas was snoring in his chair, a bottle of whiskey empty beside him. Her hands, once soft, became chapped and raw from lye soap and harsh work. Her childhood dissolved into a litany of chores, punctuated by Silas's cold demands and occasional, terrifying rages over a burnt meal or a misplaced tool. He never laid a hand on her in a way that would leave a visible mark on her face, but his cruelty was a constant, grinding pressure that wore down her spirit. He starved her of kindness, of education, of hope. He kept her isolated, ensuring she was too tired and too timid to seek help. She learned to be silent, to make herself small, to survive in the shadows of her own life. The final betrayal had come 2 weeks ago. She had been mending one of Silas's shirts by the fading light when she heard voices from the parlor. A man's voice, low and unfamiliar. She had crept closer, her heart a cold stone in her chest. She heard the words sturdy, healthy, and a good price. She heard Silas talking about her as if she were a mare he was selling, extolling her virtues as a worker. And then she heard the other man's name, McAllister, a rancher from the territories, a man looking for a wife, willing to pay for one without asking questions. She had stumbled back to her small room, a wave of nausea washing over her. She was not a person. She was property, cattle to be sold to the highest bidder. The howling of the wind brought her back to the present, to the dusty barn and the silent man across from her. He had finished his work and was now sitting on a bale of hay, sharpening a knife with a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of steel on the stone a strangely calming sound. The lantern light carved deep shadows onto his face, highlighting the sharp line of his jaw and the faint, silvery scars that traced a map of old violence near his temple. Her voice, when it finally came, was a raw, broken thing, a sound she hardly recognized as her own. "Why?" He stopped sharpening the knife, his hands falling still. He looked at her, his eyes dark and unreadable in the dim light. He did not pretend to misunderstand. He was quiet for a long moment, the only sound the shriek of the storm. When he spoke, his words were quiet, stripped of all emotion. "Didn't want to see you die." The answer hung in the air between them, simple and devastating. It was not the answer she expected. It was not about wanting a wife or needing a helper. It was something else entirely, something stark and grim that hinted at a world of pain she could not begin to understand. It offered no comfort, only a bleak, shared understanding of survival. The words, his unexpected presence, the shelter of the barn, it was all too much. The last of her strength gave out. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and the world tilted, the lantern light blurring into a smear. She collapsed, not fainting, but simply surrendering to an exhaustion so deep it felt like drowning. She curled into a ball on the hay-strewn floor, still wrapped in his heavy coat, and fell into a dreamless sleep beside the fire of the lantern. From his place in the shadows, Colt McAllister watched her. He did not move to cover her or make her more comfortable. He simply sat and watched the slow, even rise and fall of her shoulders. The storm raged outside, but a different kind of storm was brewing inside him. He had bought this girl, this broken piece of humanity, not out of desire, but out of a desperate, foolish attempt to balance a scale that could never be balanced. He had seen the desperation in her eyes on that train platform, a mirror of a desperation he knew all too well. And in trying to save her, he had only succeeded in dragging her into his own desolate world. He looked at her small, sleeping form, and a familiar, unspoken guilt, cold and heavy as a burial shroud, settled over him once more. The sun was the first master on the ranch. It rose without sentiment, a searing white disk that bleached the color from the sky and demanded work. Life settled into a harsh, unvarying rhythm, dictated by the sun's ascent and descent. Colt moved with it. He was gone before the first true light, a silent figure disappearing into the vastness to mend fences. tend to his small herd of cattle, or wrestle with the unyielding earth. He returned long after dusk, coated in a layer of dust and sweat, his face etched with a weariness that seemed to go clear to the bone. He moved like a man who had made peace with endless, punishing labor, finding a strange solace in the ache of his muscles and the sheer emptiness of the land. Eleanor's domain was the cabin. It was a world measured in feet, not miles, but it was its own kind of prison. She fought a daily, losing battle against the dust that seeped through the walls and the silence that pressed in on all sides. Her hands, soft from a life of mending and indoor chores, were clumsy with the heavy, practical tools of frontier survival. She tried to cook, to impose some small order on their spare existence. The bread she attempted to bake in the temperamental iron stove was her first casualty. One side was a black carbon brick, the other a pale, doughy mass. She threw it into the scrub behind the cabin, her cheeks burning with a shame that felt utterly disproportionate. The chickens were another trial. They were mean, feral creatures that seemed to view her as an intruder. One morning, as she reached into a nesting box, a fat, speckled hen lunged, pecking her hand with a viciousness that drew blood. She cried out, more in shock and frustration than pain, and stumbled back, cradling her throbbing hand. It was a small thing, a ridiculous injury, but it felt like another verdict delivered by this place. You do not belong here. One morning, the futility of it all became a physical weight in her chest, too heavy to bear. Colt had already ridden out, a disappearing speck on the horizon, spurred by a sudden, desperate impulse. She walked out of the cabin and did not stop. She had no plan, no destination. She just walked, putting the lonely ranch behind her, her worn boots scuffing through the dust. She walked for what felt like hours, the sun climbing higher in the sky, beating down on her head. But the landscape never changed. The horizon remained a perfect, unbroken circle around her. In every direction, there was only more of the same. Parched earth, stubborn sagebrush, and the immense, crushing sky. There was no path, no road, no sign of any other life. The emptiness was not a promise of freedom. It was a wall, more effective than any built of stone. Defeated, she turned and retraced her own footprints. The cabin a tiny, pathetic shelter against an indifferent world. On a rare afternoon when a sudden storm forced Colt to remain in the barn, Eleanor found herself with nothing to do. The rain drummed a hypnotic rhythm on the cabin roof. She had scrubbed the floors, mended a tear in her dress, and rearranged the meager tins on the shelf twice. Restless, she began to clean with a fervor born of boredom, wiping down the few pieces of furniture. In the corner sat a small, unadorned chest of drawers that Colt never used, on a whim. She pulled open the bottom drawer. It stuck, then gave way with a groan. Inside, beneath a folded wool blanket that smelled of cedar, was a leather-bound sketchbook. It felt like a trespass, but she could not stop herself. She lifted it out, the leather soft and worn beneath her fingers. She opened it carefully. It was filled, page after page, with charcoal drawings. They were not landscapes or sketches of animals. They were portraits, rendered with a skill and a tenderness that took her breath away. There was a woman, drawn over and over. She had a gentle, smiling face, framed by soft curls, and eyes that seemed to look out from the page with a deep and abiding kindness. In some drawings, she held a small child, a boy with a cap of wild hair and a bright, mischievous grin. The lines were sure, capturing not just a likeness, but a feeling. Love was embedded in the charcoal dust, in the careful shading that defined a cheekbone, in the light captured in a smiling eye. This was the life he had known before the war, before the scars, before her. This was the ghost that haunted the silent spaces of the cabin. She closed the book gently, a profound sadness settling over her. She slid it back into the drawer, beneath the blanket, and closed it. It was his secret, his pain, and she would not touch it. Her own pain was more immediate, in an effort to prove her worth, if only to herself. She decided to tackle the woodpile. The axe was heavy and poorly balanced in her hands. She swung it clumsily, missing the log more often than not. When she did connect, it was with a dull thud that barely splintered the wood. She persisted, her jaw set with a stubborn determination, ignoring the growing ache in her back and the friction of the rough handle against her palms. By evening, she had managed to split only a few logs, and her hands were a raw, fiery mess of broken blisters. She was trying to wash them in a basin of cold water, biting her lip against the sting. When he came in, he stopped and looked at her hands, then at the meager pile of wood she had stacked. He said nothing. His silence was not judgmental, merely observant. He left the cabin and returned a few minutes later with a small bowl of warm water and a tin of dark, pungent salve. He took her hands in his. His were calloused and rough, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. She flinched, a lifetime of avoiding casual contact making her recoil. He did not let go, but his grip loosened, waiting for her to settle. Slowly, she relaxed, allowing him to turn her hands over, to inspect the raw, weeping blisters. He dipped a clean cloth into the warm water and began to clean them with a careful, methodical touch. He worked in silence, his head bent, his focus entirely on the task. The sting of the water was sharp, but the gentleness of his ministration was a strange and disarming sensation. After he had cleaned them, he took a small amount of the salve and began to work it into her skin. The cool balm soothed the fire in her palms. It was the longest they had been in physical contact, a moment of profound and silent intimacy that left her feeling shaken and confused. When he was done, he wrapped her hands loosely in clean strips of cloth. He met her eyes for only a second, then stood and went about his evening chores as if nothing had happened. A few weeks later, their supplies ran low, and a trip to town became unavoidable. The journey was as silent as their first. But this time Eleanor felt a new kind of dread. The town of Harmony was not a place of comfort for her. It was a stage where her humiliation was public. As they walked down the main street toward the general store, she felt the eyes on her. The whispers started again, sharp and stinging as horseflies. Look at her, still pale as a ghost. Heard she tried to run off. Can you blame her, married to a man like that? At the counter of the general store, the proprietor's wife, a woman with a face like a sour plum, looked Eleanor up and down. You putting any meat on them bones yet, girl? A man needs a wife, not a wisp of smoke. Eleanor stared at the floorboards, her face flaming. Colt placed their goods on the counter, flour, salt, coffee, beans, and paid without acknowledging the woman's comment. His face was a stone mask. As they were leaving, a man loafing by the door looked at Colt's face, at the puckered scar that ran from his temple down his jaw. Still ugly as sin, McAllister, the man drawled. Colt did not break his stride. He walked past the man as if he did not exist, his shoulders squared, but Eleanor saw the muscle jump in his jaw. She felt the insult as if it had been directed at her. They were a pair, the wild man and the spoiled girl, bound together by the town's contempt. That night, the whispers of the townspeople echoed in her head. The shame, the helplessness, the feeling of being trapped. It was too much. This time, her flight was not a calculated walk into the daylight, but a blind, panicked scramble into the night. She did not even bother with her boots. She threw open the cabin door and ran, barefoot, across the yard and into the prairie. The darkness was absolute, and the land that was merely vast by day became terrifying by night. The ground was uneven, littered with sharp rocks and thorny brush that tore at the soft soles of her feet. The cry of a coyote in the distance sent a fresh wave of fear through her. She stumbled and fell, her hands and knees scraping against the hard earth. She got up and ran again, sobbing now, tears of pain and despair streaming down her face. She did not know where she was going. She was just running from the cabin, from him, from the life she had been forced into. She did not get far. Exhaustion and pain brought her to her knees in a patch of scrub brush. The futility of it was a crushing weight. She could run all night and die of thirst before she reached another soul. This land held her as surely as any prison bars. Shivering and bleeding, she limped back the way she came, following the faint, distant light of the lantern he had left burning on the porch. He was sitting on the steps, waiting. He did not ask where she had been. He did not scold her. He simply stood as she approached, his face grim in the lantern light. He looked at her torn dress, her scraped knees, and her bleeding feet. Without a word, he bent down, scooped her into his arms, and carried her inside. The shock of being held, of being lifted so easily, left her speechless. He set her down in a chair by the hearth and, just as he had with her hands, he brought a basin of water and began to clean her feet. He pulled thorns from her heels and washed the dirt from the cuts with a steady, impersonal touch. He wrapped them in clean bandages and then stood. "Go to bed, Eleanor," he said, his voice quiet but firm. It was the first time he had used her name. Something shifted after that night. The next morning, he did not ride out immediately. He found her by the cabin and handed her a pair of worn leather gloves. "Come on," he said. He spent the morning teaching her. He showed her how to hold the axe properly, how to use her weight to drive it, how to read the grain of the wood. He taught her how to mend a section of broken fence, his large, scarred hands guiding hers as she learned to stretch the wire taut. He was a patient teacher, his instructions sparse and direct. He did not praise her, but when she finally split a log cleanly in two, a nod of his head was more rewarding than a string of compliments. The lessons became a part of their routine. He taught her to saddle his horse, to distinguish harmless snakes from vipers, to spot a sick calf. She learned quickly, driven by a fierce, stubborn pride. She would not be useless. She would not be a burden. As she grew more capable, the cabin felt less like a prison. She was no longer just his purchased bride. She was a partner, of a sort, in the daily battle for survival. They began to eat their meals together. At first, the silence at the small table was thick and awkward, but slowly, it changed. It became a shared silence, a comfortable quiet that did not demand to be filled. There was no laughter, there was no touching, but sometimes she would look up and find him watching her, a strange, contemplative expression in his eyes. Something was growing in the space between them, a fragile tendril of understanding, nurtured by shared work and unspoken respect. One evening, their quiet routine was broken by the unexpected arrival of a rider. He was a traveling preacher, a thin, zealous man named Reverend Gideon, whose horse looked as tired as he did. He introduced himself and spoke of spreading the word of God to the lonely souls of the frontier. Colt offered him a meal and a place to sleep in the barn, his hospitality reluctant but ingrained. The preacher sat at their table, eating hungrily and filling the silence with loud pronouncements about salvation and damnation. His eyes fell upon Eleanor and Colt. "It does my heart good," he boomed, "to see a husband and wife making a Christian home in this godless wilderness. Let us pray and ask the Lord to bless this holy union." He gestured for them to bow their heads, to kneel. The word union struck Eleanor like a slap. She was transported back to the judge's dusty office, the cold ink on the page, the feeling of being sold. This man, with his talk of blessings and holiness, was trying to legitimize the transaction, to wrap it in a cloak of piety she could not stomach. "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it cut through the preacher's booming voice. The preacher looked at her, his smile faltering. "Daughter, it is a wife's duty to—" "I said no." This time her voice was stronger, edged with steel. Reverend Gideon turned to Colt, sputtering. "Brother McAllister, your wife is—" Colt pushed his chair back and stood up, his tall frame seeming to fill the small cabin. His voice was low and flat, devoid of anger but carrying an absolute finality. "She said no. I think it's time for you to leave." The preacher stared, his mouth agape, then scrambled to his feet, gathered his things, and fled into the night, leaving a shocked silence in his wake. Colt had not defended her honor. He had defended her choice. He had defended her no. Later that night, Eleanor could not sleep. She stood outside, wrapped in her shawl, staring up at the brilliant, star-dusted sky. The air was cool and clean. She heard the cabin door open and knew he was there. He did not come to stand beside her, but stood a few feet away, respecting her space. The silence stretched on, comfortable, familiar. "You don't owe me anything," he said suddenly, his voice a low rumble in the darkness. He was releasing her from the bargain, from any debt she might feel she had to him for food, for shelter, for his protection. She turned to look at him, a dark silhouette against the star-dusted horizon. 100 replies came to her mind, but she spoke the one that was most true. A quiet admission that changed everything. "That's not what I'm afraid of." The harshness of the land, once her enemy, became a crucible. Eleanor grew stronger, not just in spirit, but in body. The daily labor, which had once felt like a punishment, began to feel like a reclamation. Her arms, once thin and pale, grew sinewy from carrying buckets of water and sacks of feed. Her hands, though calloused, were now capable. She learned to ride Colt's spare horse, a steady mare named Bess, with a confidence that surprised her. At first, she rode within sight of the cabin, a small, tentative circle. Then her circles widened, growing bolder, until one day she rode to the top of a small rise and looked back at the ranch, a tiny settlement in a vast, wild sea, and felt not trapped, but rooted. Her body, for the first time in her memory, felt like her own. The ache in her muscles at the end of the day was not the dull ache of servitude, but the clean, honest burn of effort. It was the feeling of being alive. Colt watched this transformation in his usual silent way. He offered no praise, but he stopped leaving the easiest chores for her. He accepted her competence as a fact, a development as natural as the changing of the seasons. Then, one morning, she stepped out of the cabin into the cool, pre-dawn air and saw it. Attached to the 2 sturdy posts that held up the small porch roof was a swing, built of smooth, sanded planks of pine and hung with thick, new rope. It had not been there the night before. He must have built it in the dark, a quiet, nocturnal act of creation. There was no note, no grand presentation. It was simply there. Eleanor approached it slowly, as if it might vanish. She reached out and touched the wood, her fingers tracing the clean, beveled edges. It was a simple, sturdy thing, built to last. It was an object of leisure, of rest, something utterly non-essential to their survival. It was a gift, a wordless acknowledgement of her presence, not as a worker or a wife, but as a person who might want to sit and watch the sunset. She sat on it carefully, the ropes groaning softly under her weight. The sound was new, a gentle, rhythmic sound in a world of wind and work. She touched it like a fragile, precious thing, and a feeling she could not name, warm and tight, bloomed in her chest. The fragile piece of their routine was shattered a week later by the arrival of a neighbor, Jebediah, a gaunt, weathered rancher whose property was a half-day's ride to the east. He brought news, his words clipped and grim. A small homestead to the north had been raided. A family had been left with nothing but the clothes on their backs. There was talk of desperate men pushed out of the mining camps, roaming the territory like packs of hungry wolves. A new tension settled over the ranch. The vast, open spaces that had begun to feel like freedom now felt like a profound vulnerability. The silence at their dinner table was no longer comfortable. It was heavy with a low, constant hum of anxiety. That evening, Eleanor watched as Colt sat by the firelight, methodically cleaning and oiling his rifle. The soft clicks of the metal parts sliding back into place were sharp, menacing sounds in the quiet cabin. He was a man who knew violence. She had seen it in the stillness of his posture, in the economy of his movements. Now, she saw him preparing to meet it again, and a cold knot of fear formed in her stomach. That night, sleep was a shallow, restless sea. She woke in the suffocating heat of her small room, her thin nightdress sticking to her skin, thirsty. She slipped out of her cot and went into the main cabin, her bare feet silent on the cool floorboards. A low fire still glowed in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows. She stopped short. In the center of the room, lit by the flickering firelight, was a large wooden tub. Colt was in it. His back was to her. He was bathing, scrubbing away the grime of the day. For a moment, she was frozen, mortified at the intrusion. Her instinct was to retreat, to slip back into her room unnoticed. But then she saw his back. It was not the smooth, unmarked expanse of skin she might have imagined. It was a landscape of old pain, deep. Puckered scars crisscrossed his shoulders and spine, some pale and silvery with age, others a dull, angry red. They were not the clean lines of a surgeon's knife, but a chaotic map of violence, the jagged starburst of an old shrapnel wound, the long, parallel furrows left by a whip or a lash, the round, indented pockmarks of healed burns. It was the story of the war he never spoke of, written on his body in a language of pure agony. A small, involuntary gasp escaped her lips. He stiffened, every muscle in his back going rigid. He did not turn around. He simply reached for a coarse wool blanket draped over a nearby chair and pulled it over his shoulders, hunching forward, trying to hide the terrible record of his past. The movement was not one of anger, but of a deep and profound shame. He was the wild man, the scarred man the town whispered about, and in that moment, he believed himself to be a monster. The old Eleanor would have fled, overcome with fear and embarrassment. But the woman standing in the firelight was not that girl anymore. She had been hardened by the sun and the wind, and her heart had been softened by his quiet, unexpected kindnesses. She saw not a monster, but a man in profound pain, a man who had been hiding his wounds from the world. Instead of fleeing, she did the one thing he would never have expected. She walked forward slowly, her bare feet whispering on the floorboards, until she was beside the tub. She knelt. The movement was fluid, an act not of supplication, but of solidarity. She was bringing herself down to his level, meeting him in his place of shame. He kept his back to her, his shoulders tense beneath the blanket, waiting for her revulsion, for the condemnation he was so sure he deserved. Her voice, when it came, was a mere whisper, a breath of sound in the quiet room. "I have scars too." The words hung in the air, a simple, stunning confession. He did not turn, he did not ask her where they were, or how she had gotten them, and she did not offer to show him. In that moment, they did not need to. The shared, unspoken truth of their brokenness was a bond far stronger than any vow. She rested her hand for a second on the rough wool of the blanket covering his shoulder, a touch so light it was barely there, and then she stood and walked back to her room, leaving him alone with her words. From that night on, she began sleeping with the door to her room slightly ajar. It was a small gesture, but it was a bridge, a silent declaration that the wall between them was no longer necessary. A week later, a storm rolled in, one of the violent, unpredictable tempests that seemed to spring from the earth itself. The sky turned a bruised, greenish black, and the air grew heavy and electric. The first crack of lightning was a searing white whip that split the sky, followed by a boom of thunder so loud it shook the cabin to its foundations. Eleanor was mending one of Colt's shirts. At the sound, the needle slipped, and a single drop of red blood welled on her fingertip. And then another bolt of lightning struck, closer this time, hitting an old cottonwood tree near the creek. The sound was not a boom. It was a deafening, explosive crack, the sound of a world being torn apart. And for Eleanor, it was the sound The flash of brilliant, violent light threw her back into a darkness she had kept buried for years. She was no longer in the cabin. She was a child again, cowering in a dark closet, the air thick with the scent of smoke and spilled whiskey. She could hear the splintering of a door, her stepfather's voice raised in a drunken rage, the sound of breaking glass. A woman's scream that was cut short. The memory, a black, jagged thing, tore through the careful walls she had built around her heart. A scream ripped from her own throat, a raw, animal sound of pure terror. She scrambled back from the table, her chair tipping over with a crash, and collapsed onto the floor, curling into a tight ball. She was sobbing, great, gasping, uncontrollable sobs. Her hands pressed over her ears as if she could block out the thunder of the past. In the main cabin, Colt heard her scream over the roar of the storm. He was at her door in an instant, his hand on the latch. He found it blocked from the inside by the overturned chair. "Eleanor!" he shouted, his voice rough with alarm. The only answer was another broken, terrified sob. He did not hesitate. He threw his shoulder against the door. The wood groaned. He did it again, putting all his weight and strength behind it. The frame splintered, and the door flew open, crashing against the inside wall. He found her on the floor, a small, trembling heap in the corner of the room. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm inside her. He crossed the small room in 2 strides and knelt beside her. "Eleanor," he said again, his voice softer this time. She did not seem to hear him. She was lost, drowning in a memory he could not see. Carefully, he reached down and lifted her into his arms. She was surprisingly light, as fragile as a wounded bird. She flinched at his touch but did not fight him. He carried her out of the small, dark room and into the main cabin, to the relative warmth and safety of the fire. He sat in the large wooden chair by the hearth, settling her in his lap as if she were a child. He pulled his heavy coat from a peg on the wall and wrapped it around her shivering body, cocooning her in its warmth and familiar scent. He began to rock her, a slow, steady, rhythmic motion. He did not speak, he just held her, his large, solid body a silent anchor against the terrifying tide of her memories. For a long time, she continued to sob, her face buried in his chest, her small fists clenched in the fabric of his shirt. Slowly, so slowly, the rhythm of his rocking and the steady, solid beat of his heart beneath her ear began to pull her back from the edge. Her sobs quieted into shuddering breaths. The iron tension in her body began to ease. She was exhausted, her mind and body scoured clean by the violence of the memory. She felt the rough texture of his shirt against her cheek, the solid strength of the arm holding her, the warmth of his body seeping through the coat. She was safe. For the first time since her mother had died, she felt completely, unequivocally safe. He felt the shift in her. The moment she returned to the present, he stopped rocking, his body still. He looked down at her, his face a mask of concern in the firelight. He opened his mouth, the words of apology forming on his lips. Sorry for the storm, sorry for her fear, sorry for a world that had hurt her so badly. Before he could speak, she lifted a trembling hand and laid her fingers against his jaw. The touch was feather-light. She leaned her head against his chest, listening to the steady thump of his heart. "Don't say you're sorry," she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. The words stopped him. An apology would have been a kindness, but it would have also been a barrier, a confirmation of her victimhood. Her words were a rejection of pity. They were a plea for simple presence, for acceptance of the broken thing she was. He did not kiss her. The moment was too raw, too fragile for that. But he did not let her go. He simply held her, his hand stroking her hair in a slow, comforting gesture. He held her as the storm outside spent its fury and moved on, leaving behind a world that was quiet and washed clean. He held her until her breathing deepened into the slow, even rhythm of sleep. It was the first time she had let him hold her. The first time she had truly let him in. The next morning, the sun rose on a world scrubbed new by the rain. The air was clean and cool, and the dust had been settled. Colt was outside, chopping wood. The steady, rhythmic thud of the axe striking the wood was a solid, reassuring sound. From the porch, sitting on the swing he had built for her, Eleanor watched him. His sleeves were rolled up, the muscles in his back and arms flexing with each powerful swing. He was a part of this land, as strong and as scarred as the earth itself. He did not look at her, but she knew he was aware of her presence, and she did not look away. A connection, forged in the crucible of a storm, stretched between them, silent and unbreakable, as real and as vital as the morning sun. The night of the storm carved a new landscape, not on the land, but in the small, quiet spaces of the cabin. A fragile truce had given way to a tentative alliance. They began to move around each other not as a master and his purchased ward, but as two people navigating the same small, often difficult, world. They were becoming partners in the truest sense of the word. Their partnership built not on vows and promises, but on the sturdy bedrock of shared silence and mutual survival. She took to mending his shirts without being asked. One evening, sitting by the fire, she worked a needle through the worn blue fabric of a shirt that was torn at the shoulder. Her stitches were small and neat, a line of careful, quiet industry. He sat across from her, oiling a piece of leather harness, the familiar, rhythmic scrape a part of the cabin's evening song. He watched her head bent in concentration, the firelight catching the stray strands of her dark hair. She was no longer the pale, terrified girl from the train platform. The sun had given her a light dusting of freckles across her nose, and her hands, though calloused, were deft and sure. The next afternoon, he returned from a ride along the creek bed. He stopped before her where she was sweeping the porch, his large frame blocking the sun. She looked up, shielding her eyes. He said nothing, but he reached out and, with a gentleness that still startled her, tucked something behind her ear. She reached up, and her fingers found the delicate, velvety petals of a small, wild prairie rose, a defiant splash of deep magenta against the muted browns and grays of their world. Her breath caught. He held her gaze for only a second before turning away to tend to his horse. But in that second, something unspoken, as fragile and as beautiful as the flower, passed between them. Their fragile peace, however, was a private thing, cultivated in the isolation of the ranch. The town of Harmony remained a place of judgment. On their next trip for supplies, Eleanor walked with her head held high. Her resilience, her newfound strength, was a visible thing. The townspeople noticed, but their interpretation was laced with the familiar venom of suspicion and envy. They no longer saw a victim. They saw a threat. "Look at her," one woman whispered to another over a barrel of pickles at the general store. "Got some color in her cheeks. The wild man must be treating her well." The other woman sniffed, her gaze sharp and disapproving. "Or she has him under her spell. A girl like that, from back east. They have their ways. It's witchy. I tell you, how she's tamed him." The whispers followed her down the street. She was no longer the spoiled girl, but something more dangerous. A seductress, a woman who had somehow bewitched the town's resident monster, turning him into her protector. They could not conceive of a partnership built on respect, so they invented one built on sin. Eleanor heard the words, and though she did not flinch, they were like small, sharp stones pelting her skin. One sweltering afternoon, as she was drawing water from the well, she saw a rider approaching. It was not Colt, and it was not their neighbor Jebediah. It was a woman, riding a fine black mare. The woman was dressed in a dark green riding habit that was clean and well made, a stark contrast to Eleanor's own faded calico. As she drew closer, Eleanor saw that she was beautiful, with a cascade of auburn hair and a face that was proud and unyielding. The woman dismounted with a fluid grace and strode toward the cabin as if she owned it. She did not acknowledge Eleanor, her eyes fixed on the cabin door. Just then, Colt emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He stopped dead when he saw the woman, a look of disbelief, followed by something dark and unreadable, passed over his face. "Sarah," he said, his voice a low, rough sound. "Colt," the woman replied, her voice clear and carrying. "You look surprised to see me. Most people are when they see a ghost." Eleanor stood by the well, frozen, the bucket of water forgotten in her hand. She was an unwilling audience to a play that had begun long before she had arrived. She should have turned away, retreated into the cabin, but she could not move. "They told me you were dead," Colt said, his voice flat. "An Apache raid, on the wagon train." Sarah gave a short, bitter laugh. "They were wrong. I was taken. I survived. I made my way back. I spent a year looking for you, Colt, and I find you here, in this godforsaken place, with her." Her eyes finally flickered to Eleanor, her gaze sweeping over her with a cold, dismissive appraisal. The silence that followed was thick with years of unspoken history. Eleanor could feel the weight of it, the shared past that she was not a part of. She felt like an intruder, a pale imitation of the vibrant, confident woman who now stood before Colt. "What do you want, Sarah?" he asked, his voice strained. "What do I want?" she cried, her voice rising. "I want the life you promised me, the one you rode away from to fight in your precious war. I waited for you, Colt, but you never came back. Not really, just the shell of you. And now this, you buy a bride from a train platform like a common piece of livestock because you were too much of a coward to face me, to face what we had." Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. Bought a bride. The words, spoken with such casual cruelty, stripped away all the progress she had made, all the fragile dignity she had built. She was, and always would be, the girl who had been sold. Colt's voice was low, laced with a pain so deep it was almost a physical thing. There was nothing to come back to. "Sarah, the war burned it all away. I never wanted this. I never wanted a wife again. I never wanted to feel anything again." He took a step toward her, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I didn't choose her," he said, his voice dropping to a raw, ragged whisper. He did not look at Eleanor, but she knew he was speaking of her. "I saw her, standing on that platform, and something inside me, it just broke." The words were meant for Sarah, an explanation of his own brokenness, but to Eleanor, they were a confirmation of her deepest, most terrifying fear. Pity. He had not seen a partner, a person. He had seen a pathetic creature, and his own broken heart had gone out to her. He had not bought a wife. He had rescued a stray dog. All his kindness, all his gentle touches, the swing, the flower, they were not born of affection, but of a wretched, soul-crushing pity. The pain was a sharp, physical blow. She dropped the rope to the well, turned, and fled into the cabin, the sound of Sarah's bitter laughter following her. She did not cry. Her hurt was too deep for tears. It was a cold, hard rage that filled her chest. She grabbed her small valise, the one she had arrived with, and began to throw her few meager possessions into it. She would not be his charity case. She would not be the living symbol of his broken heart. She stormed out of the cabin, past Colt and Sarah, who were still locked in their tableau of past grief, and marched to the corral. She saddled Bess with trembling, furious hands, her movements clumsy but effective. She swung herself into the saddle and dug her heels into the horse's flanks, sending her galloping away from the ranch, away from him. She rode hard, pushing the mare, not caring where she went, only that it was away. She rode until the horse was lathered and gasping, until her own rage had burned itself out, leaving behind a hollow, aching emptiness. She slowed the horse to a walk, Her shoulders slumped in defeat. She had nowhere to go. There was only one place with a roof, a place where she could perhaps trade work for a bed for the night. The town. She arrived in Harmony as the sun was setting, casting long, sinister shadows down the main street. She tied Bess to the hitching post outside the saloon, the only place that still showed signs of life. She needed a room, perhaps at the boarding house. But first, she needed a drink of water. Her throat was parched and coated with dust. She pushed open the swinging doors of the saloon. The room went quiet as all eyes turned to her. It was a place for men, filled with the smell of stale beer, sweat, and cheap tobacco. A few prospectors, a handful of disgruntled farm hands, and the town drunk were her audience. She walked to the bar, her back straight, and asked the bartender for a water. "Well, look what the cat dragged in." A voice slurred from a nearby table. It was the same man who had mocked Colt's scars. He and two of his companions got up and ambled over to her. "The wild man's pretty little bird? Did you fly the coop?" Eleanor ignored him. Taking the glass of water, the bartender reluctantly slid toward her. "Not so chatty, are you?" the man said, moving to stand behind her, blocking her exit. "You know, we all wondered what a man like McAllister would do with a wife. Must be lonely out there." "Maybe you're looking for some real company." His companions snickered. Eleanor felt a cold dread creep up her spine. She finished her water and placed the glass on the counter. "Excuse me," she said, trying to push past them. The man put a hand on her arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Not so fast. We're just being friendly." His face was too close, his breath sour. "Let go of me," she said, her voice low and trembling. "Or what?" he sneered, his friends moving to flank her, their leering faces closing in. "You gonna scream for your scarred-up husband? He's not here to save you, little bird." They had her cornered against the bar. The bartender turned away, polishing a glass, making it clear he would not intervene. Her heart was pounding, the old, familiar terror rising in her throat, choking her. And then the saloon doors swung open with such force that they slammed against the inside walls. Colt stood there, framed in the doorway, a silhouette against the twilight. His face was a thundercloud, his eyes blazing with a cold, lethal fury. He took in the scene in an instant. The men, their hands on Eleanor, the fear in her eyes. He did not speak a word. He moved with a terrifying speed and efficiency. He grabbed the man who was holding Eleanor's arm by the collar, spun him around, and hit him once. It was a single, brutal punch that made a sickening crunching sound. The man collapsed to the floor like a sack of grain, unconscious. The other two men stumbled back, their drunken bravado vanishing in the face of such cold, controlled violence. Colt did not even look at them. His eyes were only on Eleanor. He shrugged off his heavy canvas coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, pulling her close, shielding her from the stares of the room. He put his arm around her and led her out of the saloon, leaving the silence and the man on the floor behind him. He lifted her onto his horse, which was tied next to hers, and then mounted behind her, his body a solid, protective wall. He took the reins of her horse, and without a word, they rode out of town and back into the dark, silent prairie. The ride home was a long, suffocating silence. When they reached the cabin, he dismounted and lifted her down. He led her inside and lit a lantern. The room was filled with a tension so thick she could barely breathe. She could not bear it. She spun around to face him, her fists clenched, the anger and hurt from the afternoon rushing back. "Tell me the truth, Colt," she demanded, her voice shaking. "No more silence. No more secrets. Why did you buy me? Was it pity? Am I just some wounded animal you felt sorry for?" He looked at her, his face haggard in the lamplight. For a moment, she thought he would retreat back into his silence, but then he sighed, a long, ragged sound, and the walls he had kept around himself for so long finally began to crumble. "My brother's name was Daniel," he began, his voice low and hoarse. "He was younger than me. He followed me everywhere. One winter, We were chasing a rabbit across the frozen pond behind our house. I told him the ice wasn't thick enough, but I went anyway. He followed me. The ice broke. I tried to reach him, but I was too small." He paused, swallowing hard. The memory, a ghost in his eyes. My father, he never looked at me the same after that. A few years later, there was a fire in the barn. He went in to save the horses. The roof collapsed. I stood there and watched it burn. There was nothing I could do. He looked at his hands, as if seeing the fire and the ice there. Then the war came, and I was glad to go. I wanted a good reason to die. The war, it takes everything from you. It burns everything clean. Your friends, your hope, your soul. It leaves nothing behind but the scars. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a pain so vast she felt she was drowning in it. When I came back, Sarah was gone. My home was gone. There was nothing left. So I came out here. I wanted to feel nothing. And for a long time, I succeeded. He took a step closer, his gaze intense. Then I saw you, on that train platform. You had this look in your eyes, like a cornered animal that had forgotten how to fight, but hadn't forgotten how to hurt. And it wasn't pity I felt, Eleanor. It was recognition. You were the first thing I had seen in years that made me feel anything at all. It was like looking in a mirror, and it broke me. His confession, his raw, unvarnished pain, silenced her own anger. He had not seen a pathetic creature. He had seen himself. She looked at this man of scars and silence, who had just laid his entire broken soul at her feet, and she knew she had to do the same. Slowly, her hands trembling, she reached for the top button of her blouse. She undid it, and then the next, and the next. She did not do it with seduction, but with a solemn, terrifying honesty. She pushed the fabric of the blouse off her shoulders, letting it fall to her waist. She turned her back to him, to the firelight. Her back, like his, was a map of old pain. Faded, silvery lines, the unmistakable pattern of a lash, crisscrossed her skin from her shoulders to her waist. They were the silent testimony of her years with Silas, of his rages, of the price of a burned meal or a slow response. "You didn't ruin me," she said, her voice quiet but strong, a tremor of emotion running through it. She was not just speaking to him, but to herself, to the ghost of the girl she had been. "But I'm tired of hiding like I'm ashamed." She felt him move behind her. She expected him to touch the scars, to trace the lines of her past, but he did not. He simply stood there, his presence a warm weight in the room. When he spoke, his voice was thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. He turned her around gently to face him. He looked into her eyes, and she saw not pity, but a profound and aching tenderness. He lifted a hand and cupped her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek. They came together then, for the first time. It was not a clash of passion, but a quiet, trembling convergence. His lips were soft, hesitant, as if he were touching something sacred. It was a kiss of shared sorrows, of mutual understanding. It was tender and quiet, and it shook them both to the core. He lifted her into his arms and carried her to his bed. The act was a slow, reverent exploration. They were two broken people, with scarred bodies and wounded souls, finding a place of healing in each other's arms. As he held her, his body trembling with the weight of years of unspoken feeling, he started to whisper the words, the apology for all the pain, all the sorrow. But she put her fingers to his lips, stopping him. Her own voice broke as she whispered the words that had become their prayer, their covenant. "Don't say you're sorry." The morning after was a country of its own, a silent, unfamiliar territory with no map. An intimacy so profound had left them strangers again, shy and overwhelmed. They did not speak of the night before. They did not touch. They moved around the small cabin with a new, painful awareness of each other, their bodies humming with a language their minds could not yet translate. The air was thick with unspoken feelings, a fragile, shimmering thing they were both terrified of breaking. They avoided each other's eyes. When he came in for water, she would suddenly find a pressing need to inspect the herbs drying by the window. When she was by the hearth, he would busy himself with a piece of tack out on the porch. The silence, which had once been a shared comfort, was now a taut wire stretched between them, vibrating with the memory of shed skins and whispered confessions. They were raw, exposed, and the everyday world felt too harsh for their new, tender surfaces. They did not know how to be the people they had been the day before, and they did not know how to be the people they had become in the dark. So they turned to their hands. They poured all the unnamed, overwhelming emotion into work, into the creation of a life they had never allowed themselves to imagine. Colt began to build a table. He dismantled the rough-hewn plank on barrels that had served them and, with a focus that was deep and absolute, began to shape a proper dining table from seasoned pine he had stored in the barn. For days, the sounds of his saw and plane were a steady, rhythmic pulse at the ranch. Eleanor would watch him from the cabin doorway, his brow furrowed in concentration, the muscles in his back moving with a sure and steady purpose. He was not just building a table. He was building a center for their world, a place for them to sit and face each other, a solid, tangible foundation for a future he did not dare speak of. While he worked with wood, she worked with cloth. She found a bolt of soft, faded blue cotton in the bottom of her valise, a remnant of a life before Silas that she had clung to, with her small sewing kit. She began to make curtains for the single window in the main cabin. Her stitches were as precise and as focused as his saw cuts. The thin, worn material, when she was finished, did not block the harsh prairie sun, but it softened it, filtering the light, turning the stark, dusty glare into a gentle, hazy blue. The cabin, once a mere shelter, a box against the wind, began to feel like something else. With a solid table at its center and soft blue light filtering through the window, it was becoming a home. Their work was a silent conversation. Each pass of his plane was a sentence. Each of her stitches was a reply. They were building a domesticity they had never known, a quiet, fragile piece constructed from wood and thread. It was in the midst of this gentle, industrious quiet that trouble arrived, riding in on a sway-backed nag and smelling of stale whiskey and desperation. Eleanor was hanging laundry on a line stretched between the cabin and a post when she saw him. Her heart seized, a cold, hard fist in her chest. It was Silas. He was thinner than she remembered, his face gaunt and unshaven, his clothes little more than rags, but the same cruel, proprietary look was in his small, dark eyes. He slid off his horse and strode into the yard as if he had every right to be there, his gaze sweeping over the small, tidy ranch with a contemptuous sneer. "Well, now," he slurred, his eyes landing on Eleanor. "Look at you, playing house. I knew that wild man would take a shine to you. You always were a sturdy piece of property." The word, property, struck her with the force of a physical blow. Colt emerged from the barn, drawn by the unfamiliar voice. He stopped when he saw Silas, his body going still and watchful, his hand dropping instinctively to his side, near the place where a gun would hang, though he wore none. "You've got no business here," Colt said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Silas laughed, a ragged, ugly sound. "Oh, I think I do. That's my girl you've got there. I raised her, fed her, and you paid a handsome price for her. I'll grant you that. But I'm a sentimental man. And I'm broke. I've come to take back what's mine." He took a drunken step toward Eleanor. Colt moved to intercept him, placing his body between Eleanor and her stepfather. "She's not yours. She's my wife." "Wife?" Silas spat. "You call a piece of paper from that drunken judge a marriage? I call it a bill of sale, and I'm here to void the contract. Either you give me more money, McAllister, or I take the girl and sell her to someone who will—" He lunged, not at Colt, but toward Eleanor. Colt moved like lightning, grabbing Silas by the front of his filthy shirt and shoving him back. "Eleanor," he commanded, his voice sharp. "Go inside. Stay there." She hesitated, her feet rooted to the ground, torn between the instinct to obey and the fierce, protective urge that was rising in her. "Colt!" "Now!" he roared, his eyes never leaving Silas. She ran, stumbling up the porch steps and into the cabin, shutting the door behind her but pressing her face to the window. The fight was not a clean, heroic battle. It was a brutal, clumsy, desperate brawl in the dust of the yard. Silas was fueled by whiskey and a mean, cornered animal rage. Colt was stronger, but he was holding back, his movements defensive, as if the act of violence itself was a poison he was trying not to swallow. They grappled, their boots churning the dust, their grunts and curses ugly sounds in the quiet afternoon. Silas was wiry and quick, landing a glancing blow to Colt's jaw. Colt answered with a solid punch to the gut that sent Silas stumbling back, gasping for air. But Silas was treacherous. He came up from his crouch not with his fists, but with a handful of dirt and gravel, which he threw into Colt's face. Colt cried out, staggering back, clawing at his eyes. In that moment of blindness, Silas charged, tackling him around the waist, and they both went down in a heap. Eleanor watched in horror as they rolled in the dirt. Silas, with a surge of desperate strength, ended up on top. His hands, thin and hard as talons, found Colt's throat. He squeezed, his face a mask of purple rage, his knuckles white. Colt's hands clawed at Silas's wrists, but he was off balance, his strength failing, the air being squeezed from his lungs. His face began to darken, his struggles growing weaker. Eleanor's world narrowed to that single, horrific image. The man who had shown her kindness, the man who had held her through a storm, the man who had looked at her scars and not flinched, was being killed in her yard, and it was her past, her ghost, that was killing him. A cold, clear calm washed over her. She did not scream. She did not cry. She acted. She turned from the window, her eyes scanning the cabin. Her gaze fell upon the small, short-handled shovel they kept by the hearth for scooping ash. She grabbed it, the wooden handle solid and real in her hands. She threw open the cabin door and ran down the steps. Silas did not hear her coming. He was too consumed by his murderous rage. She did not hesitate. She lifted the shovel high and brought the flat iron head of it down on the side of his head with all the strength in her body. The sound was a sickening, hollow thud. Silas's eyes rolled back in his head. His grip on Colt's throat went slack, and he collapsed sideways into the dust, unconscious. Colt lay on the ground, gasping, great, ragged gulps of air, his hands at his bruised throat. Eleanor dropped the shovel and fell to her knees beside him, her hand hovering over his chest, not daring to touch. "Colt!" she whispered, her voice trembling. He coughed, turning his head to look at her, at the shovel lying in the dirt, at the still form of her stepfather. A complex, unreadable emotion passed through his eyes. Before either of them could speak another word, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made them look up. The sheriff, alerted by a neighbor who had seen Silas ride in, was cantering into the yard. The aftermath was a blur of official procedure. The sheriff, a weary, practical man, questioned them both. Silas was hauled to his feet, groaning, a large, bleeding welt on the side of his head. As he was being tied to his horse, he looked at Colt, his eyes filled with a venomous, spiteful hatred. "This ain't over, McAllister," he snarled. "You think you've won? I'll tell everyone. I'll tell them how you keep my Eleanor here against her will, a prisoner, a slave to your unnatural appetites. By the time I'm done, this whole town will see you for the monster you are." He was led away, his threats echoing in the quiet yard. The sheriff looked from Colt's bruised throat to Eleanor's pale, set face. "He's a liar and a drunk, but his poison will spread," he said quietly. "People in this town, they're quick to believe the worst." He tipped his hat and rode off, leaving them in a silence that was heavier and more threatening than ever before. The next few days were filled with a tense, waiting silence. The peace they had built had been desecrated. The threat Silas had made hung between them, a cloud of poison that seeped into the very walls of their home. They knew what was being said in town. They could feel the weight of the whispers, even miles away. It was Eleanor who broke the silence. She could not live like this, hiding from the shadows of her past, allowing a liar to define her, to define them. She had to face it, not just for herself, but for Colt, the man whose name was being dragged through the mud because of her. On Sunday morning, she put on her best dress, the simple gray one she had arrived in, and told Colt she was riding into town. He looked at her, a question in his eyes. "I'm going to church," she said, her voice quiet but firm. He did not try to stop her. He simply saddled Bess for her and watched her ride away. She arrived just as the service was beginning. She slipped into a pew at the back, her heart pounding. The preacher's words were a dull drone in her ears. She saw the looks, the whispers that passed between the women. They saw her as a curiosity, a scandal, the prisoner of the wild man. She let them look. She waited. When the preacher had finished his sermon and asked if anyone had a testament to share, a profound silence fell over the small, stuffy church. Eleanor stood up. Every head turned toward her. She walked from the back of the church, her footsteps echoing on the wooden floorboards, all the way to the front, where she turned to face the congregation. Her voice, when she began, was a low, trembling thing. "My name is Eleanor McAllister," she began. "Many of you know me only as the woman who was brought here to be Colt McAllister's wife. You have whispered about me. You have judged me. And you have judged him." She took a deep breath, her gaze sweeping over their faces. "The curious, the hostile, the indifferent. I want to tell you the truth, not the truth you've invented for your gossip, but my truth." Her voice grew stronger, clearer, shedding its tremor. "My mother died when I was a child. The man who raised me, my stepfather, was not a father to me. He was a master. For 10 years, he worked me like an animal. He kept me hungry. He kept me isolated. And when I displeased him, he hurt me." A wave of shock rippled through the congregation. Some people shifted uncomfortably in their pews. "I was not a daughter to him," she continued, her voice ringing with a terrible clarity. "I was his property. And when he grew tired of me, he sold me, like a horse or a sack of grain. He sold me to Colt McAllister. That is how I came to be here." She paused, letting the ugly words hang in the air. "The man you call the wild man, the monster, that man has never laid a hand on me in anger. He has given me shelter. He has treated me with a kindness I had never known. He has protected me. And last week, when my stepfather came to our home to drag me away, to sell me again, Colt defended me. He defended my life, my freedom." Silence. A deep, profound, uncomfortable silence. A few of the women were openly crying, their faces buried in their handkerchiefs. Others stared at the floor, their cheeks flushed with shame. They were seeing not a spoiled girl or a witch, but a woman who had survived a horror they could barely imagine. She was no longer ashamed. The shame was now theirs. As she finished speaking, her eyes scanned the back of the church. He was there. Colt had followed her. He was standing by the door, his hat clutched in his hands. He had heard everything, and as her eyes met his across the silent, crowded room, she saw tears tracking paths through the dust on his cheeks. That night, the air in the cabin was different. It was clean. The poison had been drawn out. She found him sitting by the fire, staring into the flames, lost in thought. She came and sat on the floor beside his chair. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then, she reached out and took his large, calloused hand in hers. She looked up at him, her heart full of a feeling that was so new and so powerful, it felt like it might break her open. "You're not the one who broke me," she said, her voice soft and sure. You're the one who waited." A shudder went through him. He lowered his head, a gesture of profound, aching vulnerability, and rested it in her lap. She stroked his hair, her fingers tracing the faint, silvery scars at his temple. He had carried his own brokenness for so long, in such silence. Slowly, she began to undo the buttons of his shirt, pulling the rough fabric away, exposing the scarred landscape of his back to the warm firelight. She leaned down, her lips brushing against the damaged skin. "Let me love you like you never were," she whispered. Their coming together that night was not the trembling, desperate act of two wounded souls finding solace. It was a quiet, reverent act of healing. It was slow and gentle, and filled with a tenderness that was as profound as it was unspoken. It was not a taking, but a giving. It was a love born not of hunger, but of a deep and abiding grace. The seasons turned, and the ranch turned with them. The land, which had once been a canvas of harsh browns and grays, began to show hints of color, of life. Eleanor, with a patience she had learned from Colt, had cultivated a small garden near the cabin. She had turned the hard, unforgiving soil, coaxed life from it with water drawn from the well, and protected the tender shoots from the relentless sun and wind. And now, things were growing. Hardy vegetables pushed their green heads through the earth. But more than that, there were flowers, patches of vibrant bluebells and stubborn, cheerful sunflowers that turned their faces to the sky. Flowers were blooming where nothing was ever meant to grow. A quiet, defiant testament to the healing power of a careful hand. Their life took on the rhythm of this new, gentle landscape. The silences between them were no longer heavy with unspoken pain, but filled with a deep, companionable peace. They moved together in the shared work of the ranch, a partnership so seamless it was like a silent dance. She would leave a jar of cool water for him by the corral fence. He would leave a freshly split pile of firewood by the cabin door. They were small, wordless acts of love, the only language they needed. Their home was no longer just a shelter. It was a sanctuary they had built together, a place where two broken people were slowly, carefully, becoming whole. Their healing began to ripple outward, touching the lonely lives of their few neighbors. The Henshaws, who lived a few miles south, had a young daughter, Martha, a shy, silent girl of 10 with eyes that were always downcast. Her mother confessed to Eleanor that the girl could not read a single word, and so, twice a week, Martha would walk the dusty miles to their ranch. Eleanor would sit with her on the porch swing, a simple primer open on her lap, and with a gentle, unwavering patience. She would unlock the magic of letters. She taught the girl not just to read words, but to find her own voice. At the same time, the Henshaw's boy, Samuel, a strapping lad of 14, had a mortal fear of horses after being thrown as a child. Colt, seeing the boy's shame, took him under his wing. He did not use force or demand bravery. He started with the oldest, gentlest mare, simply having Samuel stand with her, stroke her neck, and speak to her in a low voice. For weeks, that was all they did. Then came the brush, then the saddle blanket, then the saddle. Colt moved with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who understood fear, who knew that trust, once shattered, had to be rebuilt one small, steady piece at a time. The day Samuel finally mounted the horse and rode a slow, triumphant circle around the corral, Colt stood by the fence, a rare, small smile touching his lips. Word of these quiet acts of community traveled, carried on the wind to the town of Harmony. The whispers about the wild man and his purchased bride began to fade, replaced by a new, grudging respect. The townspeople, who had once scorned them, began to see them differently. They saw a woman whose quiet strength had faced down a brute and spoken a truth that shamed them all. They saw a man whose scarred hands were not just capable of violence, but of a profound and steady patience. The change became official one Tuesday afternoon with the arrival of a buggy. It carried the town's new preacher, a young, earnest man who had replaced the fire and brimstone Reverend Gideon, and Miss Albright, the stern but fair-minded schoolteacher. They sat awkwardly on the porch swing, accepting glasses of lemonade from Eleanor, their purpose hanging unspoken in the air. Finally, Miss Albright cleared her throat. "Mrs. McAllister," she began, her tone formal but her eyes kind. "We have heard what you have done for the Henshaw girl. There are other children on the outlying homesteads who have no access to schooling. The town board has authorized me to ask if you would consider becoming a teacher, holding a class for these children twice a week in the church hall." Eleanor was so stunned she could not speak. To be offered a position of such trust, of such importance, by the very people who had once judged her so cruelly, was a validation so profound it brought tears to her eyes. Then the preacher turned to Colt, who was leaning against a porch post, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "And Mr. McAllister," he said, "the schoolhouse roof was damaged in the last storm. None of the men in town have the skill to fix the main truss. We were told you have experience with timber framing. We would consider it a great favor if you would lend us your expertise. We would, of course, pay for your time." To be asked not just for his strength, but for his skill. To be invited to build and mend in the center of the town that had cast him out was a form of acceptance he had never expected. He looked at Eleanor, at the hope and surprise in her eyes. He gave a single, slow nod. "I'll do it," he said. "No payment necessary." That night, after their visitors had gone, a deep and peaceful quiet settled over the ranch. They had been seen. They had been accepted. They were no longer island outcasts, but a part of the world again. Later that evening, while Colt was out checking on the livestock, a soft rain began to fall. Eleanor, feeling a deep sense of peace, moved about the cabin, tidying the few objects that now made it a home. She went to the small chest of drawers in the corner to put away a freshly mended cloth. As her hand brushed against the bottom drawer, she remembered the sketchbook. She had not thought of it in months, had not dared to look at the ghosts of the woman and child he had loved so fiercely. But now, something was different. That past was no longer a threat, no longer a rival to a future she could not imagine. It was simply a part of the man she had come to love. With a steady hand, she opened the drawer. The sketchbook was still there. She lifted it out and sat at the new table he had built, the lantern casting a warm, golden glow on the worn leather cover. She opened it, expecting to see the familiar, smiling face of the woman from his past. But the face that looked back at her from the page was her own. Her breath caught in her throat. It was a drawing of her, asleep on the porch swing, her head tilted to one side, an expression of profound peace on her face. The charcoal lines were both tender and sure, capturing the curve of her cheek, the gentle drape of her dress. She turned the page. Another drawing. This time she was standing by the fire, the light catching the side of her face, her expression strong, resolute, her gaze fixed on something beyond the frame. He had seen the strength in her that she had only just begun to see in herself. She turned the page again, and a soft, choked sob escaped her lips. It was a drawing of her laughing. She remembered the day. Samuel Henshaw had just ridden his first solo circle, and a wave of pure, unadulterated joy had washed over her. She had thrown her head back and laughed, a sound so unfamiliar and so wonderful it had startled them both. She had thought it was a fleeting moment, lost to the wind, but he had caught it. He had seen it, memorized it, and rendered it here on the page with such loving detail that she could almost hear the sound. He had not just seen her pain and her resilience. He had seen her joy. She was so lost in the drawings that she did not hear him come in. He stood in the doorway, rain glistening on his shoulders, and saw the open sketchbook on the table. He did not move, did not speak, his face vulnerable in the lantern light. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She did not need to say anything. He walked over to the table and gently closed the book. He took her hand and led her out onto the covered porch. The rain was falling softly now, a gentle, cleansing sound. The air smelled of wet earth and sage. They stood for a long time, listening to the rain, his hand holding hers. "Eleanor," he said, his voice a low, quiet rumble. He turned to face her, and then, to her astonishment, he knelt before her on the damp wooden planks of the porch. He held her hand in both of his gaze steady and full of a deep, quiet reverence. "I'm not asking you to forgive my past," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I'm not asking you to forget yours. I'm asking you to share a future. Marry me, Eleanor. Not because of a contract, not because of a bargain, but because you are my home." She did not say yes. Words were too small for the feeling that was cresting in her heart. She knelt in front of him, her knees meeting his on the porch floor. She framed his face with her hands, her thumbs stroking the rough, scarred skin of his jaw. She leaned in and kissed him, a kiss that was not about passion, but about promise. It was a kiss that tasted of rain and redemption. When she finally pulled back, she looked into his eyes and whispered, "No one gave me a choice before, but I choose you." Their wedding was not held in the church. It was held on their land, in a field of wildflowers, under the vast and benevolent sky. The entire town of Harmony came. They stood in a wide, silent circle, their faces a mixture of curiosity and awe. Eleanor wore a simple cream-colored dress she had sewn herself, and in her dark, unbound hair, she wore a single blue ribbon. She walked toward him barefoot, the soft, cool earth beneath her feet, a reminder of the ground she had claimed as her own. Colt stood waiting for her, dressed in a clean shirt, his hair slicked back with water, as she walked toward him. This vision of strength and grace, this woman he had seen at her most broken and now saw at her most beautiful. He did not hide the tears that streamed down his face. They exchanged their vows in their own words, simple promises to stand by each other, to shelter each other, to be each other's safe harbor. The town watched in a profound silence, unsure if they were witnessing the end of a long, hard story of survival, or the beginning of a quiet, powerful love story. They did not understand that it had always been both. The story ends as it began, at the door to the small, sturdy cabin, after their guests had departed, leaving them in the peaceful twilight. Colt placed his hand gently on the small of Eleanor's back, a gesture of quiet possession, of loving guidance. They walked inside, into the home they had built not just with wood and thread, but with the shattered pieces of their own souls. The fire was glowing in the hearth, casting a warm, welcoming light. She turned to him, her face illuminated by the flames, with a soft, confident smile. Her hands went to the laces of her own dress. She began to undo them, her movements sure and steady. He watched her, his heart in his eyes. She was not the frightened girl he had brought here. She was his wife, his partner, his equal in every way. She stepped closer to him. Her dress loosened, and laid her hand on his heart. "Don't say you're sorry," she said again, the words no longer a plea, but a soft, loving command. "Just stay. Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire. Please let us know in the comments where you are tuning in from to connect with others. And we invite you to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.